In the wild and dusty Old West, where the law struggled to keep control and danger lurked around every corner, not all outlaws made their mark with brute force. Some stood out for something far more dangerous: their intelligence. Three men, cunning, calculating, always one step ahead, whose stories still echo through the dust and legend. Today, you'll discover who they really were. In the Old West, legends are carved into history through violence. But few stories are as dark, unsettling, and enigmatic as that of Johnny Ringo. His life came to an end beneath a lonely oak tree, under tragic circumstances, with a revolver still resting in his hand. The official ruling declared it an act of desperation. But the truth, much like the life of the man himself, is far more complex. To truly understand the ending, we must return to the tragic beginning. If stories like this captivate you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. The origin of the shadow. The youth of Johnny Ringo. The name Johnny Ringo echoes across the dusty plains of American history, a figure wrapped in mystery, often more myth than man. Seen by some as a melancholic gunman with a taste for literature, a so-called gentleman outlaw, and by others as a cold-blooded killer without mercy. The truth about John Peters Ringo is far more complex, forged in family tragedy and baptized in the violence of one of the most brutal feuds in Texas history. To understand the legend, we must first unearth the man himself, beginning with his roots and the path that forever diverted him from the possibility of an ordinary life. John Peters Ringo was born on May 3, 1850, in Greens Fork, Indiana. He was the firstborn son of Martin and Mary Peters Ringo. The Ringo family enjoyed a reputation of respectability and was relatively well educated for the time. In 1856, they moved to Liberty, Missouri, seeking new opportunities. However, the call of the West proved irresistible, and in 1864, the family, now with 5 children, joined a wagon train and embarked on a grueling journey of more than 3,000 kilometers toward California. For John, a 14-year-old boy, the journey began as a grand adventure. It would soon become a nightmare that would mark his soul forever. On July 30, 1864, as the wagon train crossed Wyoming territory, tragedy struck. While stepping down from his wagon, Martin Ringo stumbled. The 12-gauge shotgun he carried by the barrel fell, discharged accidentally, and killed him instantly, right before the eyes of his wife and children. Young John Ringo was the first to reach his father's lifeless body. The family was forced to bury Martin in a shallow grave beside the trail and continue their journey the very next day. The psychological impact of such an event on an adolescent is impossible to measure. The image of his father dying so suddenly and violently became a permanent shadow in John's existence. While never formally documented, it is a plausible interpretation that this trauma played a decisive role in the darkness that would later consume him. Led by the widowed Mary Ringo, the family eventually completed the journey and settled in San Jose, California. For several years, life appeared to stabilize, but unrest grew within John. In late 1869, at just 19 years old, John Ringo left California behind and traveled alone to Texas, a land still wild, filled with men seeking fortune or courting trouble. It was there that the once quiet young man began to transform into the gunman history would remember. The Texas Crucible. By 1874, Ringo had settled in Mason County, Texas, a region on the brink of violent collapse during what became known as the Mason County War, also called the Hoodoo War. Ringo quickly aligned himself with the American faction and became a close friend and primary ally of Scott Cooley, a former Texas Ranger. It was in this environment that Ringo's darker side fully emerged. He soon became associated with the violence of the conflict and was suspected of involvement in several killings related to the war, including those of Mose Baird and James Chaney. Although direct evidence was scarce, his reputation as a dangerous man was firmly established. In 1876, during a crackdown on the conflict, Ringo was arrested. But law enforcement in Mason County was weak, and with the help of his allies, he escaped custody, solidifying his status as an outlaw. The boy who once watched his father die on a lonely trail was now walking a violent path of his own, one that would take him even farther, deep into the dark heart of the Old West. The Arizona Gunmen rise to notoriety. After escaping the law in Texas, the Mason County War left Johnny Ringo with a reputation marked by blood and few prospects for the future. Texas had become too small and too dangerous for a man like him. As the 1870s drew to a close, Ringo turned his gaze westward once more, toward the newly formed Arizona Territory. It was a land of promise and anarchy, where the law was often enforced by the barrel of a gun, the perfect stage for a man like Johnny Ringo. By 1879, he arrived in Cochise County, a boiling cauldron of tension between miners, ranchers, speculators, and outlaws, all drawn by the silver wealth of Tombstone. In Arizona, Ringo quickly found his place. His reputation preceded him, and he was soon welcomed by the most powerful outlaw faction in the region, the Cowboys. Far from simple cattle hands, the Cowboys were a loose confederation of ranchers and cattle thieves, informally led by figures such as Curly Bill Brocious, Old Man Newman Haynes Clanton, and his sons Ike and Billy, as well as Frank and Tom McLaury. They controlled vast stretches of territory and operated a lucrative smuggling operation moving stolen cattle from Mexico. Ringo's intelligence and cold demeanor set him apart within the group. Unlike many of his companions, he was known as a voracious reader, with a particular fondness for Shakespeare and other classical works, giving him an aura of dangerous sophistication. Yet this cultivated side was often overshadowed by his volatile temperament, especially when alcohol was involved. Periods of deep melancholy were frequently followed by sudden, unpredictable violence. In December 1879, Ringo reinforced his fearsome reputation during an incident in a saloon in Safford, Arizona. When local rancher Lewis Hancock refused to drink with him, Ringo, deeply offended, drew his revolver and fired at point-blank range. The bullet passed through Hancock's ear and neck. Miraculously, he survived. Ringo was arrested, but in a clear demonstration of the fragile nature of frontier justice, he was ultimately acquitted. The message was clear. Johnny Ringo was a man who tolerated no insult and was willing to use lethal force over the smallest provocation. Vengeance and collapse, the twilight of the Cowboys. After the gunfight at the OK Corral on October 26, 1881, the conflict escalated into open warfare. Though absent from the shootout, Ringo emerged as one of the most dangerous figures among the now demoralized Cowboys. The ambush of Virgil Earp and the murder of Morgan Earp pushed Wyatt Earp beyond the limits of the law. Justice would now be taken by force. Wyatt launched his infamous Vendetta Ride, a relentless campaign across Arizona. Johnny Ringo stood high on the list of targets. Though he and Doc Holliday famously confronted one another in Tombstone, the legendary duel never occurred. Only hatred, threats, and unfinished business. The Cowboys were hunted down one by one. The death of Curly Bill Brocious in March 1882 shattered the faction completely. Ringo was left alone. A man without allies, without purpose, and without a war left to fight. By the summer of 1882, Johnny Ringo was a shadow of his former self. With the Cowboys dismantled and the Earp brothers gone, he was dangerously isolated. Alcohol became his refuge, and his behavior increasingly erratic. In early July, Ringo left Tombstone and rode toward the Chiricahua Mountains. 2 weeks later, on July 13, 1882, his body was found beneath a large oak tree in Turkey Creek Canyon. He was seated, his revolver in his hand, a single gunshot wound to the temple. The coroner ruled it suicide, but questions lingered. No powder burns, a missing horse, a rifle leaning nearby. And so, the mystery was born. Was it despair or murder? Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, Frank Buckskin Leslie, all were suspected. None were proven. Johnny Ringo passed into legend, not merely as an outlaw, but as a tragic figure. A literate man consumed by violence, whose life ended in a mystery the Old West never solved. They didn't find him in a duel. There was no final standoff, no warning, no chance to draw. Bill Wilson was killed from behind, shot without ceremony, without honor, and almost without a trace. In the mythology of the Old West, men like Wilson are supposed to die facing their enemy, gun in hand, eyes locked. But that's not what happened, and that's exactly why his story matters. Because the truth about the West is that most men didn't get a heroic ending. They were bushwhacked, ambushed, erased in a moment, before they even understood what was happening. Bill Wilson was known as a gunfighter. Not the most famous, not the most feared, but dangerous enough to have a reputation. And that alone, in that time, was enough to put a target on your back. Very little about his early life is certain. Like many men of that era, his past is fragmented, scattered across accounts, rumors, and partial records. But by the time his name began to circulate, it carried weight. Wilson was associated with violence, with disputes that didn't end in words. And in a world where law was inconsistent at best, men like him became both necessary and feared. They enforced order and disrupted it at the same time. Gunfighters lived in a strange space. Some were hired, some were hunted. Most were both, at different points in their lives. And Bill Wilson was no exception. He moved through territories where tension was constant, where conflicts could escalate quickly, and often did. A disagreement over land, a debt, a look held too long. In that environment, survival depended on awareness, on speed, on reputation. But reputation is a double-edged thing. The more people know your name, the more they think about how to end it. And Wilson, like many others, had enemies. Not all of them known, not all of them visible, because the most dangerous threat in the Old West wasn't always the man standing in front of you. It was the one you never saw. Bushwhacking was common, more common than the stories tend to admit. It didn't require skill in a duel. It didn't require courage. Only timing, position, and the willingness to shoot a man who never had the chance to respond. For some, it was cowardice. For others, it was practicality. Because facing a gunfighter head-on was a risk few wanted to take. And Bill Wilson was exactly the kind of man you didn't want to face directly. Accounts describe him as capable, alert, a man who understood how quickly things could turn, which makes what happened to him all the more telling, because even men like that could be caught off guard. The details of his final moments are not fully documented. There is no single clear narrative, only fragments. But the outcome is consistent. He was ambushed, shot unexpectedly, and killed before he could react. No witnesses describing a showdown, no dramatic exchange, just an abrupt end. And then, silence. His death didn't become legend in the way others did. There were no grand retellings, no embellished duels added later for effect. If anything, his story faded, overshadowed by names that fit the mythology more cleanly. But in that absence, there is something more honest, because Bill Wilson's death reflects a reality that is often overlooked. The Old West was not defined by fair fights. It was defined by uncertainty and by the constant possibility that violence could come from anywhere, at any time, without warning. Men like Wilson lived with that understanding. They knew that skill with a gun didn't guarantee survival, that awareness had limits, and that reputation could only protect you up to a point. After that, it made you a target. And once someone decided to act on that, the outcome was often already decided. Because bushwhacking removes the one thing a gunfighter relies on most: choice. There is no moment to assess, no time to draw, no opportunity to negotiate, only impact. And then, nothing. Bill Wilson's story doesn't end with a final stand. It ends with an absence, a sudden break. And that, in many ways, is closer to the truth of that world than any duel ever was. To understand what happened to Bill Wilson, you have to understand the kind of world he was living in. Because bushwhacking wasn't rare, it was part of the landscape. In fact, it was often the most logical way to deal with a man like him. The term itself, bushwhacked, comes from exactly what it suggests: an attack from concealment, from behind trees, rocks, buildings, anywhere that gave the advantage of surprise. And in a place where survival mattered more than reputation, that advantage was everything. Contrary to popular belief, most gunfighters didn't spend their lives in dramatic duels. Those moments were the exception, not the rule. The reality was quieter, more calculated, and often more brutal. If someone wanted you gone, they didn't announce it. They waited, they watched, and they chose the moment when you were least prepared. That's what made bushwhacking so effective and so feared, because there was no defense against it, no skill that could fully protect you. Even the fastest draw in the territory meant nothing if the shot came from behind. Men like Wild Bill Hickok understood that. He was one of the most skilled gunmen of his time, careful, experienced, always aware of his surroundings. And even he was killed while sitting with his back to the door, not in a duel, not in the street, but in a moment of routine. That was the truth of the West, and Bill Wilson's death fits directly into that pattern. He didn't lose a fight. He never had one. And that distinction matters because it tells us something important about the kind of danger he represented. If someone chose to bushwhack him, it likely meant they didn't believe they could beat him otherwise. It wasn't just an act of opportunity, it was a decision, a calculation. And once that decision was made, the outcome was almost inevitable. There are no detailed accounts of who pulled the trigger, no confirmed identity, no trial, which again was not unusual. Justice in many of these cases simply didn't happen, or it happened in ways that were never officially recorded. The man responsible may have walked away, blended back into the same environment that allowed the act in the first place. Because the Old West was full of men who carried histories that no one fully knew, and no one fully questioned. That uncertainty is part of what defines Bill Wilson's story. There's no clean ending, no resolution, just a life that intersected with violence and ended in it. And while his name may not be as widely remembered, his death represents something broader, a pattern that repeats across the history of that era. Because for every famous duel, there were countless other deaths that happened without witnesses, without recognition, without narrative. And yet, those are the moments that shaped the reality people lived in. If you strip away the legend, what remains is a world where survival depended less on bravery and more on caution, on positioning, on knowing when to be visible and when not to be. Bill Wilson, by all accounts, understood that, and still, it wasn't enough. Which raises a final question. If even experienced gunfighters couldn't avoid that fate, what chance did anyone else really have? That's the part of the Old West that often goes untold. Not the duels in the street, but the silence before the shot, the moment no one sees coming, and the reality that, in that world, the end rarely looked the way stories would later describe it. No warning, no final words, just a single moment that decided everything. In the American West, reputation was everything. A man could become a legend for how fast he drew a gun, how many men he killed, or how long he managed to stay alive. But there was one outlaw who became famous for something entirely different. He wrote poetry, and not in a saloon, not by a fire, but at the scene of his crimes. After robbing stagecoaches, he would leave behind handwritten verses, calm, deliberate, almost reflective, as if the robbery itself wasn't the whole story. They called him Black Bart, and for nearly a decade, he carried out a series of robberies across California without firing a single shot. No gang, no violence, no chaos. Just a man appearing on a quiet road, stopping a stagecoach, and disappearing into the landscape. To understand how unusual that was, you have to picture the world he lived in. Late 19th century California was still raw. Travel was slow, often dangerous. Stagecoaches carried not only passengers, but payroll, gold, and company funds, making them prime targets. And most men who robbed them did so with force, quick, loud, and often deadly. Black Bart did the opposite. He relied on timing, presence, and control. Witnesses would later describe the same scene again and again. A lone figure standing in the road, face covered, usually with a flour sack. No sudden movements, no shouting. Just a steady voice instructing the driver to hand over the strongbox. And remarkably, that was enough. Some drivers later admitted they believed they were surrounded, that he must have had accomplices hidden in the trees, but there's no evidence he ever did. It was a performance, carefully constructed, and it worked. He would take the money, sometimes exchange a few words, and then walk away. Not run, walk, as if he knew no one would follow. And in most cases, no one did. But what truly set him apart came after, because on at least a couple of occasions, he left something behind. A poem. Not a signature in the traditional sense, but something more personal. One of them read like a quiet complaint, almost philosophical, a reflection on hardship and perhaps on the life he had chosen. It didn't glorify the crime. It didn't threaten. If anything, it revealed a man who thought deeply about what he was doing, which only made the mystery more compelling. Because who was this man? Black Bart was not his real name. He was born Charles Bowles, a man who, by all accounts, lived an ordinary life for many years. He worked as a miner, tried his hand at farming, spent time moving between states, like many others searching for opportunity during that period. There was nothing particularly remarkable about him. No early signs of violence, no record that suggested he would become one of the most unusual outlaws of his time. But sometime after the Civil War, his life began to change. The details are unclear. What we do know is that by the mid-1870s, Charles Bowles had begun operating under a different identity. carefully, quietly. He didn't seek attention. In fact, everything about the way he worked suggests the opposite. He avoided confrontation, he minimized risk, and he developed a pattern that was almost methodical. He targeted specific routes, often in remote areas where visibility was limited and escape routes were available. He struck quickly and left even faster. And perhaps most importantly, he never stayed in one place long enough to be known, which made him incredibly difficult to track. For law enforcement at the time, this presented a serious problem. There were no photographs to circulate, no centralized system for identifying suspects, and very few reliable descriptions. Just stories, fragments, a man with a covered face, a calm voice, and an unusual habit of writing poetry. Over time, those details began to accumulate, and with each new robbery, the name Black Bart spread further. Not just as a criminal, but as something closer to a character, a figure people talked about, speculated about, even, in some cases, admired. Because in a landscape defined by violence, he represented something different, controlled, measured, almost disciplined. But that kind of consistency comes with a cost, because the more precise a person becomes, the more predictable they can be. And without realizing it, Black Bart was beginning to leave behind something far more dangerous than a poem, a pattern. And patterns can be studied, they can be anticipated, and eventually, they can be broken. By the early 1880s, the pursuit of Black Bart had become more focused, not because he had made a dramatic mistake, but because investigators had started paying attention to the details. Small things, the locations of the robberies, the timing, the consistency in how they were carried out. What once looked like isolated incidents was beginning to form a pattern, and among those studying it closely were agents working for Wells Fargo. At the time, companies like Wells Fargo didn't rely solely on local lawmen. They had their own investigators, men whose job was to follow trails that others overlooked. And in Black Bart's case, that made all the difference. Because for years, he had controlled every variable, every movement planned, every encounter rehearsed. But no system is perfect, and eventually, something slipped. It happened during one of his later robberies. The setup was familiar. A remote road, a stagecoach approaching. Black Bart stepped out, as he had done many times before. The robbery itself went as expected. Quick, quiet, efficient. But this time, something was different. A passenger resisted. There was tension, confusion, and for the first time, Black Bart didn't leave entirely undisturbed. He was forced to retreat more quickly than usual, and in that moment, he left something behind. Not a poem, something far more revealing. A handkerchief. At first glance, it seemed insignificant, just another piece of cloth dropped in the chaos. But for the investigators, it was the first real clue they had ever found. It had a laundry mark. Faint, but legible, a simple identifier used by laundries to keep track of customers. And unlike eyewitness accounts or rumors, this was something concrete, something that could be followed. The mark led them to a laundry in San Francisco. From there to a list of names. And among them, one stood out: Charles Bowles. It wasn't immediate. There was no dramatic arrest that same day. What followed instead was quiet observation, the kind that takes patience. Investigators began tracking his movements, watching where he stayed, noticing patterns in his behavior. And slowly, the image began to align. The timelines matched, the locations made sense, and perhaps most telling of all, the man they were watching fit the profile almost perfectly. Older than most outlaws, reserved, careful, exactly the kind of person who could operate unnoticed for years. In 1883, they made their move. Charles Bowles was arrested, not in the middle of a robbery, but in the ordinary rhythm of his daily life. No chase, no gunfight, just a quiet conclusion to a long investigation. When confronted, he didn't react like a typical outlaw. There was no denial filled with anger, no attempt to escape. Instead, he acknowledged enough to confirm what they already knew. Black Bart had been found. What followed was equally unusual. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced. But even then, the tone of the case remained different. There was no record of violence attached to his crimes, no victims to testify about injuries, only theft, calculated, repeated, but restrained. He served several years in prison, and when he was released, he didn't return to crime. In fact, he disappeared, quietly, much like he had operated for years. No confirmed robberies, no new identity that could be clearly traced, just absence. And that, perhaps, is the most fitting end to his story, because Black Bart was never about spectacle. He didn't rely on fear in the way others did. He relied on precision, on discipline, on understanding how people think and how they react. And in doing so, he created something rare in the history of the American West. Not just a criminal record, but a narrative, one that blurred the line between outlaw and character, between crime and expression. Even today, his poems are remembered, not because they were masterpieces, but because of where they were left, at the edge of a road, after a robbery. In a world where most men used violence to be remembered, Black Bart chose something else. And somehow, that made his story last longer than most. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content.